The following work is brought to you by Script Crib. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon for more information on our works. And as always, if you want to know more about what we're doing and be up to date when we release it, always like and subscribe. Phillip Cassidy was a useless bottom feeder. He had a terrible life, one filled with misery of his own making. It was boring, drab, and not something that anyone would truly want to be a part of. It was full of routine without much regard for any excitement, no matter how much he yearned for it. He was a coward who would not go out and seek any adventure, and when it would finally reveal itself to him, he would flee from it like he would if the cubicle he worked in was on fire. Phillip sat at his desk as he did every day. He was the definition of a paper pusher, and not a very good one at that. He was a man who wore a white shirt with an unremarkable tie, who sat behind a desk and slaved over his boss's every whim. To sum up, Phillip's life was terrible. While others in his family had risen to prominence, his brother was an attorney and both of his sisters married into money, Phillip had chosen a life that was incredibly dull. This was his own fault, and by this point in his existence, he had accepted it as such. He longed for the excitement and adventure of the battlefield, where he could be a hero and prove his worth. But instead, he found himself trapped in a monotonous cycle of work and sleep, with nothing to show for it except a meager paycheck and a bleak future. While during the day, Phillip was a simpleton who was a slave to the time clock. At night, he was a traveler in a distant world where friend and foe alike quivered at the mere mention of his name. Declan Bartholomew, adventurer extraordinaire, was his alias when he sat at his computer. He was gifted with a shield and an axe, and even better with a bow. The games he played allowed him to venture into a world where he could be superior to any of those around him and no foe would stand in his way. No matter how hard he tried, though, he could not exude the confidence he showed in the imaginary world into the one he occupied physically. Declan Bartholomew was who Phillip yearned to be, but Phillip Cassidy was who he was unfortunately chosen to play. That was, however, until he met her. Her name was Olivia, and she was unlike anyone he had ever met. She had a fiery spirit and an adventurous soul, and she was determined to show Phillip a world beyond the confines of his mundane existence. She was tall and slender, but had curves in all the right places. Her eyes were almost as blue as the sky behind her, a mass of dark hair in a contrast to the sun-kissed glow of her skin. Her honey-brown hair was cascading over her shoulders, her smile was contagious, and her laugh so natural and unforced. She was a whirlwind of beauty and a beacon of light to the world. She walked with a grace and beauty that could leave angels envious. She was far too good for Phillip Cassidy. They met at the local coffee shop, where Phillip went to escape the monotony of his job. He was lost in thought, staring blankly at his coffee when Olivia walked in. She was wearing a leather jacket and had a backpack slung over her shoulder. Her eyes met Phillip's, and for a moment, he felt like he was staring into the sun. She walked over to him and introduced herself, and before he knew it, he was smitten. Phillip couldn't believe his luck. For the first time in his life, he had finally found someone he could relate to. Not only had Olivia entered his life, but she had also ignited a spark within him that he never knew existed. She had taken him on adventures he could only dream of, hiking to the top of mountains, exploring caves, and discovering hidden waterfalls. With Olivia, he felt alive in a way he had never before. However, like all good things, and most importantly, everything in Phillip's life, it came to an end. While Olivia was able to bolster Phillip, Phillip's boring, mundane existence was too much of a burden on her. Now, with Phillip sitting at his desk staring at the same sheet of paper that had been in front of him for hours, his mind could not escape her. His productivity had sunk and his boss had begun to take notice. Phillip was lost in thought, unable to shake the image of her from his mind. He closed his eyes and let out a deep sigh, knowing that he couldn't continue like this. He needed to take a break. He pushed himself away from his desk and sighed heavily. He rose to his feet quietly, hopefully trying to avoid the dim gaze of his supervisor. With silence in his steps, he made his way outside, the cool breeze hitting his face and making him feel alive. As he walked, he couldn't help but think about her again. Her long, dark hair, her piercing blue eyes, her soft skin. He had to see her again. He pulled out his phone and dialed her number, his heart racing as he waited for her to answer. This is foolish, he thought as he found her contact info on his phone. Why are you doing this? However, it was too late. Hello? Her voice came through the phone, and Phillip felt like he was drowning in her melody. Hey, it's me, he said, trying to sound casual. His voice quivered as the words slipped off of his lips. Phillip? She sounded surprised. Is everything okay? Phillip listened intently to the sound of her voice, as well as everything in the background. She was out in a crowded area, though it made sense. This was typically when she went to lunch with her coworkers. I needed to hear your voice, he admitted. I'm sorry, I'll let you get back to your lunch. There was a pause before she spoke again. Phillip, you need to move on. The words came over the receiver and pierced Philip's soul. Where Olivia delivered the grandest of highs, she just pounded him into the deepest of lows. The greatest thing that he had ever experienced in the world was telling him that it was over, and this time it felt final. "Of course," he remarked softly. "Have a good lunch." Philip hung up the phone without letting her reply, knowing that any other words that came from her mouth would only bring him more harm. Like he learned when he was on his alias, sometimes it was best to cut bait and try again later, or maybe it was time to rethink if the reward was truly worth it. Philip placed his phone in his pocket and stepped back into the building. Once inside, he was met with the piercing eyes of his boss, Carl. Carl's balding head and wrinkled face bellied a body that was still strong, even if he was getting up there in age. His almond-shaped eyes regarded Philip intently, but not with anger. Not yet. As Philip got closer, he caught a whiff of his breath, which was quite pungent. The smell of cheap whiskey and cheap cigars created an aura around Carl that was unfathomable. Philip took a deep breath and braced himself as he stepped closer to Carl. He could feel the anger emanating off of him in waves, and could almost see it hovering in the air around them. Carl's tongue lashings were as brutal as they were belittling. "I didn't realize it was time for your break, Philip," Carl said in a stern voice. "Do the rules no longer apply to you?" Philip felt sweat begin to beat up on his forehead as he stood there with no response. He had completely forgotten about his break and was too embarrassed to admit it. "No, sir," he finally managed to utter out. Carl narrowed his eyes at Philip, then sighed heavily before speaking again. "You're lucky I'm not docking any extra hours from your pay," he replied gruffly. "Now go back to work." Philip nodded his head and quickly walked away, not daring to turn back around for fear of incurring further wrath from Carl. As he went about his task for the day, all Philip could think about was how much nicer it would be if Olivia were there with him instead of working at her own job miles away from him. He sighed heavily. Why did life have to be so difficult? He couldn't shake her memory, no matter how much he told himself it was over. Back at his desk, the same sheet of paper that was there when he left was still staring at him. The black words that were written on it were boring and, in his eyes, illegible. Philip didn't care, nor did he want to. In his mind, the life that he was yearning for was now out of reach. For the next few hours, Philip completed the task that Carl required, though not at the pace that was dictated. However, the day was soon to come to an end, and Philip's mind went toward what he was going to do in the evening. While he typically spent time at home, at his computer, he wondered if he needed to do something more. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath of the uncomfortably warm office air. "Why don't you go out tonight?" he muttered, trying to coax himself into stepping away from a world of comfort and instead into a place where he could potentially meet new people. He met Olivia by chance. Perhaps he could meet someone else. Filling the empty void was his new mission, and he couldn't do it at his computer. He had to step out into the world. Philip rose to his feet and glanced down at his desk. His work was complete, but a pungent odor was approaching. Without looking up, he knew Carl was near. "Where do you think you're going, Cassidy?" asked Carl from outside the door. Philip turned around to face Carl and swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. "I was just heading out for the night, sir," he replied, hoping that his voice didn't betray his anxiety. Carl's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer to Philip, looking him up and down like a predator sizing up its prey. "And where do you think you're going to go?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Out to some seedy bar to drink away your sorrows?" Philip bristled at Carl's words, feeling a sudden surge of anger. "No, sir," he replied firmly. "I was just planning on going out to socialize and maybe meet some new people." Carl snorted derisively. "Yeah, good luck with that," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Just don't come crying to me when you get mugged or something." Philip fought back the urge to talk back to him, but he knew it wouldn't end well. Carl scoffed and walked away, smiling as he turned his back to Philip. "I'm tired of being his punching bag," Philip thought as he gathered his things. "One day I'll stand up to him. One day I'll just quit." After collecting his things, Philip left the office without speaking with anyone else. He stepped out of the main door and into the parking lot, immediately making his way to his car. He sat behind the wheel for a few moments, lost in thought. He knew he was going to go out tonight, but he didn't know where to start. He thought about going to a bar or a club, but that didn't seem like his scene. He needed something different, something that would take his mind off of Olivia and his crummy job. However, like most things in life, Philip had no direction or inclination on where to go. So as he turned on the car's ignition, he put it in drive in the hopes that he would find something that would entice him. As he drove aimlessly through the city for an hour without any good fortune, a neon sign caught his eye. It read, "The House of Pleasure." Philip's heart skipped a beat. He had heard of this place before. It was a high-end strip club known for its beautiful dancers and extravagant parties. It was the type of place that he never thought he would set foot in, but tonight, it seemed like the perfect escape. He pulled into the parking lot and took stock of what was around him. There were new and expensive cars, sports cars, and a few luxury vehicles, alerting Philip that there was a vast array of people who frequented this establishment. The sound of fast cars revving their engines mingled with the subtle noises coming from inside the establishment. Philip parked his car in the back of the lot, hoping to not draw any attention to himself. He stepped out and made his way to the entrance. A large man stood at the doorway. His short hair was slicked back and his muscles bulged under his tight shirt. Across his burly arms were very well drawn and ornate tattoos. His gaze was stern. Anyone who looked at him would have cause to regret it afterward. The bouncer looked like he could break someone like Philip in half if he chose to, but he shifted on his feet and let Philip pass by without incident. Like most people, he didn't seem to think Philip was much of a threat. Philip was greeted by a world of flashing lights, trendy people, and loud music. He took a deep breath. The stench of cigarettes, alcohol, perfume, and cologne filled his nostrils. He noticed young, attractive women inside the lounge, but he was afraid to go inside any further. He had never been to a strip club before and feared he would stick out like a sore thumb. "You've made it this far, Philip. Now's not the time to chicken out," he thought as he stood still just past the door. After a few deep breaths, Philip was ready to keep moving. As he meandered forward, his feet were greeted with a red carpet, and on both sides of the path, portraits of the ladies who would be entertaining him were adorned along the walls. "Why are you here?" he asked quietly to himself as he admired the decor. A smirk came over him as he entered the large, open area. Girls barely wearing anything were dancing on stage with men sitting around throwing money at them. The girls were twirling on poles while the men were gawking. Philip was uncomfortable, though the feel of a gentle hand on the small of his back grabbed his attention. He turned to see a stunning woman with long, curly hair and bright red lipstick. She wore a tight-fitting, sequin dress that accentuated her curves. "Hi there," she purred, her voice low and sultry. "Looking for some company?" Philip's heart raced as she leaned in closer. Sure," he stammered. "I don't really know what I'm doing here." The woman smiled at him reassuringly. "Don't worry about it," she said. "Just relax and enjoy yourself. Can I get you a drink?" Philip nodded, grateful for the distraction. As the woman went to fetch his drink, Philip looked around the room, taking in the sights and sound. He had never been in a place like this before, and he felt both excited and nervous. The music was loud and thumping, the lights were flashing, and the air was thick with the smell of alcohol and perfume. The woman returned with his drink, a whiskey neat, and handed it to him with a seductive smile. "My name is Scarlett," she said, introducing herself. "What's yours?" Declan," he replied, opting to use his alias instead of his real name. He took a sip of his drink, feeling the sensual burn immediately take hold of his throat. "It's nice to meet you." Scarlett leaned in closer to him, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "So, Declan, what brings you to the House of Pleasure?" Philip took another sip of his drink, feeling the alcohol starting to loosen him up. He was immediately glad that he introduced himself as Declan, because he had a strong feeling that the woman he was speaking to was not named Scarlett. They were both acting, and Philip was happy to play the part. "I don't know," he said, shrugging. "I guess I just needed to escape for a while." Scarlett nodded sympathetically. "I know the feeling," she said, running a finger along the rim of her own glass. "Sometimes you just need to let loose and forget about everything else." Philip found himself nodding in agreement. He had always been a bit of a loner, except when he was at his computer screen. This was a much different experience for him, and was truly something he would be experiencing in his online world. Scarlett must have sensed his apprehension, because she placed a hand on his arm and leaned in closer. "Don't be nervous," she whispered, her breath hot against his ear. "Just enjoy the ride. It's all about having fun and letting go." Philip felt a shiver run down his spine at her words. He had always been so restrained and controlled, but something about Scarlett's presence made him feel alive and free. He looked around at the other men in the club, all of them throwing money at the dancers on stage. It was a world he had never experienced before, and part of him wanted to dive in head first. "Come on, why don't you follow me?" she said in a sultry voice. "There's a place we have here where we don't let the regular Johns back. Come on." She smiled warmly at Philip as he nodded and rose to his feet. Scarlett led him over to a small VIP area away from the crowds. The area was dimly lit and decorated with plush furniture and exotic plants. Once they were seated, Scarlett leaned in and whispered in his ear, "I have a special dance just for you, Declan." Philip's heart beat faster as Scarlett sat down next to him. He could feel the heat emanating from her body, and the scent of her perfume was intoxicating. He took another sip of his whiskey, feeling the liquid burn its way down his throat. He watched as Scarlett stood up and make her way over to the stage. The lights dimmed and the music slowed down. Scarlett began to move her body in a seductive dance, swaying her hips to the slow beat. Philip couldn't take his eyes off of her as she removed her dress, revealing her gorgeous body clad in a skimpy lingerie set. Scarlett's movements became more erotic as she danced her way over to Philip. She straddled him, her body pressing against his as she continued to move. Philip could feel her warmth against his skin, and he couldn't help but respond to her touch. Scarlett leaned in close to him, her lips brushing against his ear. "Do you like what you see?" she asked seductively. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I do." Scarlett smiled, her eyes flashing with excitement. "Good," she said, leaning in to kiss him. Her lips were warm and soft against his, and he found himself responding eagerly to her kiss. As she pulled away, she whispered in his ear, "Let's take this to the back." Philip didn't hesitate as Scarlett took his hand and led him to a private room in the back of the club. The room was dark and intimate, with a large bed dominating the center of the space. Scarlett turned to him, her eyes full of desire. "Are you ready?" she asked seductively. "Do you want to feel a true, sensual release?" Philip didn't even have to think about his answer. He nodded eagerly, his heart racing with anticipation. Scarlett moved closer to him, her hands running up and down his chest as she kissed him deeply. The kiss was electric, and Philip felt his body responding to her touch. He pushed her back onto the bed, his hands running over her body as he kissed her passionately. As the night wore on, Philip lost all track of time. With Scarlett, he experienced things he had never even dreamed of before. Her touch, her words, and her movements sent him into a frenzy of passion and desire. By the time he emerged from the club, the sun was beginning to rise. Philip couldn't believe what he had just experienced. It was as if he had stepped into a completely different world, one where he was free to explore his deepest desires and fantasies. As he walked back to his car, he knew that he would never forget this night, and that finally he had forgotten about Olivia, if at least temporarily. His mind was now fully on Scarlett, if that was even her name. He reached his car and placed his hand on the handle. He smiled from ear to ear, still thinking about the experience from the club. "Hey, Declan!" shouted a voice from several meters away. He turned to see Scarlett, now clad in a hoodie and jeans, coming toward him. Even in street clothes, she was a vision of loveliness. Her dark hair framed an angelic face of 2 honest eyes, a button nose, and a full set of lips. She was a vision of perfection that he never thought he would see again. "Hey, so breakfast?" she asked. Philip continued to smile, unable to remove it from his face. "Sure, but only if you tell me your real name, Scarlett," he said casually. "Sure thing, but only if you tell me yours," she retorted playfully. The two laughed as Philip walked over and opened the door to his car. "It's Philip," he said, reintroducing himself. "My name is Phillip Cassidy."